What are the things that really might just make a difference, that take us out of a conventional nature conservation headspace and start to really push the boundaries of what can be done? And of course, one of the huge advantages we have is we've got the land to do it.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm very excited to be here with my friend Bev Nichols, who has, I think, the coolest job title of anyone I've met in England, and that is the Forest Wilding Programme Manager for Forestry England. Bev, thanks so much for taking the time to join me, and thanks also for walking around Canwood with me a few weeks ago and giving me so much wonderful advice.
Oh no, it was a real treat and a pleasure, Ben. To hear turtle doves for the first time in a very long time was quite special too.
The turtle doves are an incredible arrival. That purring sound seems designed to kind of calm and soothe the human soul, and it's a sound I'd never heard before. I'm amazed I've reached the age of 44 and had never heard what should be this ubiquitous sound of the Southern English summer. So hopefully that program will work out. When I used to think of Forestry England, I'd think of monocropping of commercial monocultures and production of timber on an industrial scale for industry and so on. But in fact, what I come to realize, especially during nearly 5 years as a non-executive director at DEFRA, is that Forestry England is pretty avant-garde when it comes to restoring landscapes and experimenting and doing species reintroductions. The return of white-tailed eagles to the Isle of Wight, for example, was pioneered by Forestry England. And of course, we've got you, the Forest Wilding Programme Manager. I mean, it's kind of amazing what Forestry England's doing. Can you just give me a little overview of the programme and kind of where Forestry England's headed when it comes to rewilding our landscapes?
Yeah, it is a remarkable programme, and it's a remarkable change, I think, too, for Forestry England in managing the public forests, or the nation's forests, as we call them. I mean, so it's useful to sort of wind back to when it all started. So going back to when the Forestry Commission was established back in 1919, immediately after the First World War, recognised that there was a strategic need for timber. So much timber had been used, obviously, in the trenches, and there was a need for pit props, all these sorts of things. And the forest cover in England is still very low by European standards, but it was even lower then. I think it was about 3 or 4%. So there was a major need to just very quickly establish that strategic timber reserve and also support the forest timber industry in this country. And it really sort of existed in that way, really right through to the 80s. And although I think if you asked individual foresters what their opinion was about nature, because these folk work outdoors, they were familiar with it, but it wasn't a primary purpose at all. And there was a sort of slow change through the 80s, 90s, and then the early part of this century, and just how important managing for nature Forestry England's role was. And there's some legislative changes and so on. So alongside producing timber, recreation is a really important part of what we do. We supply more countryside visits than any other organisation in the country, apparently. But the third part of that function is actually about nature now. So it is a really significant part of what we do. And I can obviously go into more detail about some of the things we're doing, but partly this has been pressed upon us by two things. One is climate change, and the other is just forest resilience. You mentioned those monocultures, and of course, most of them were planted as monocultures, often on what the time was deemed to be poor grade agricultural land, so on moorland, on heaths, coincidentally the places we value for nature now, but not at the time. And I sort of joke sometimes, who knew that if you plant thousands and thousands of hectares of exactly the same species, exactly the same age, they're vulnerable to disease and so on. And of course, that sort of ecological reality is coming home to roost on our forests now, where our climate change predictions show us we can't carry on producing timber that way. We need a different mix of species. And also actually things like pests and diseases, they're just coming in quicker and quicker. And those forests are not resilient to that. So we have to have more diverse forests. We have to have a range of structure, range of species and so on. So all of our forests will be changing anyway, just to make sure they're still there in 100 years' time. But on that, we've layered something else, which is forest wilding.
And how big is the Forestry England estate today?
It's huge. We're the biggest landowner in England, so that's 250,000 hectares. So we have a massive footprint, particularly in the uplands. We own, I think, nearly as much land in national parks as the National Trust does, and 2 major forests in Kielder, for instance, which is about 70,000 hectares, and the second major one, which is Thetford Forest in my part of the world in Norfolk and Suffolk. Then, of course, we look after the New Forest as well on behalf of the Crown, which is, again, is now sort of 20 or so thousand hectares. So there's some really big chunks, as well as lots and lots of really tiny woods right across the country.
And the priority is still to produce timber. So the Forestry England is effectively a business. You're growing trees and you're producing timber for the nation. But you now have these 2 other purposes that are layered in, which are amenity and then more recently nature and wilding. How significant is the first in comparison with numbers 2 and 3?
So it's still a primary purpose. And you mentioned that we're like a business. We're not like a business, we are a business. So the whole organisation costs about £80 million to run. And we're a part of government. We're a bit of DEFRA, if you like. Costs about £80 million to run. And the grant we get is only 12 million from government. That's gone down from about 20 million 10 or so years ago down to 12. Everything else we have to earn ourselves, and we do that predominantly through timber, but also through other things like recreation and something you're probably aware we do some live events of gigs in the summer, which is really popular. So we have to generate a lot of our income. But increasingly, we're getting additional funding from DEFRA for some of these really new things like woodland creation and forest wilding.
I went to the Netherlands, I think on every episode since I went, I've mentioned this trip because it was so seminal for me. But I went to the Netherlands about 4 weeks ago and looked at some of the rewilding that's happening there, a lot of which is tied into natural flood management. The Netherlands is the delta lands. They are the delta of the Rhine. And when it floods, it really floods. So they know better than any people, perhaps anywhere in the world, how to manage flooding. And they've created these extraordinary veins of nature that run along the watercourses down towards the sea. And these are like fat, wild, vibrant corridors, and they're just absolutely extraordinary in terms of their ability to hold water in terms of flood defense, but they're also just full of nature. And they've got big herbivores and horses, and I was very surprised to learn that the State Forest Service is probably the most important actor in the development and managing of those wild places. And they're not forests. These are wild mosaics of habitat. They're bogs and wetlands and open woodland savannas. And in this country, the Forestry England remit really says they've got to have forest. They've got to have trees on it. Is that true? Or do you have properties that are not forest, that don't have many trees? Do you have peat bogs or open grasslands or heathland? And to what extent are you able to increase the amount of land that isn't strictly closed canopy forest within the portfolio?
That's a really good question. So, actually, I was in the Netherlands a few weeks ago as well, and sort of was looking at some of this and sort of some of these huge areas which are being rewilded effectively, and they've got conic horses grazing and even bison in some places as well. And they're managed, as you say, for flood management. And it's a really key point is the emphasis for Forestry England. It's still very much on timber. That's still very, it's still an important part of what we do. We're one of the biggest importers of timber in the world, second or third only to the USA and China. So it's still a really important thing that we do. But actually, broadly, what we deliver is loads of ecosystem services. So we've done analysis of this, and it's worth, I can't remember the figure, but it's billions worth of value to the public for that 12 million quid. So we're pretty good value. In terms of things like clean water, clean air, and as well as increasingly flood management. So very similar to the Netherlands or anywhere else, the establishment of those forests very often were on uplands, as I said, which were drained to create the areas of forest. And one of the things we're starting to do in forest wilding is restore the natural hydrology. And of course, that in turn slows the flow downstream. And we're looking at reintroducing beavers and so on. So, which I'm sure you've covered extensively on the podcast already. But to answer your question about the open space, so yes, we already have a lot of open space as part of that estate. So obviously the New Forest, a lot of that is open heathland. Places like Kielder, we have a large area of blanket bog. Obviously considerable areas were planted during the early part of the 20th century when the need for timber, at least in some quarters, overrode the need for those blanket bogs to be intact. But also we do have a programme of creating more open space. So one of the projects actually I was closely associated with about 15 years ago was looking at Thetford Forest, which is the largest lowland forest, which is about 20,000 hectares, and thinking, how can that be better for nature? And one of the things we've done there is done some really good work thinking how can you create not just rides through the forest, but functional corridors. And now that's our biggest open space project going on in Forestry England at the moment. We're in the middle of creating 600 hectares of new corridors through Thetford Forest. And that links heath to heath across the landscape. And we're now also tying in with one of the largest farm networks in the country so that we can link those corridors through to those farms who are doing really good work for nature as well. So it's a really amazing thing that we can do. And of course, that's part of what Forestry England can do, is because we've got such a footprint right across the country, we can work with others so that the work that we do isn't just confined to a land, but we can really extend all of that really great work across much, much larger areas beyond our own boundaries.
So you can own properties and manage properties purely for nature. The New Forest, for example, isn't a timber production zone. How many places are there where really it's about nature and amenity and not at all about timber production?
Yeah, interesting one. So at the moment, we can't actually buy land. So we can't acquire land just for nature. There has to be a forestry purpose in there, and that's all tied up with our statutory purpose as it is in the Forestry Act. And I think that is something that's being looked at because, I mean, I think you can see there's this thing called the National Estate for Nature, which I think you're probably familiar with, where the government recently was talking to all of the large public bodies as well as some of the large farming businesses as well, and saying, how can this do more for nature? And I think you could roll forward a few years, and I think you could see us as a much more key player in buying land where nature is the primary reason rather than, say, a secondary or tertiary reason. So a lot of the land that we have is already a site of special scientific interest. So it's something like, I've got the figure here actually, 67,000 hectares is already a site of special scientific interest. So that's, what's that, about 20% or so of the estate is already, more than that actually, nearly 30% is already valued for nature. So we manage all that, and we manage that pretty well. In terms of our sort of favourable condition rankings, they're pretty good compared to the national average. But the kind of changes I'm talking about in terms of just general forest resilience will drive change so that all of those forests are better for nature. But then the thing we're doing in forest wilding is really quite something different. It's actually saying, what are the ecological processes that are missing from these landscapes? And we actually use the term wilding rather than rewilding, partly because these are landscapes where largely some kind of commercial forestry is still a key part of what we're doing. But you'd be familiar, obviously, with the idea of, we want more natural processes to be active in any particular landscapes. But often, one of the things I find often is the conversation sort of stops there. And you go, well, what natural processes are we talking about? So one of the things we've done is just done some thinking on that and think, well, what are all the natural processes that you take a particular area. So you take somewhere like Wild Kielder, which is our biggest wild area project, 6,500 hectares tucked up against the Scottish border. About 2,500 hectares of that is more or less monoculture Sitka. The rest is moorland of one description or another. And in that landscape, we think, well, what are the processes that are already active and which ones are missing? One of the ones that's missing is natural herbivory. There's lots of deer, there's some feral goats, but that's where it stops. The hydrology of that landscape has been highly altered, firstly by agricultural drainage going back many centuries and then coming through to when the forest was established earlier in the 20th century, that was drained too. So we think, well, natural hydrology is an ecological process. How do we restore that? Natural herbivory is an ecological process. So how do we restore that? Things like having wild boar in the landscape, which are creating disturbance, which is really great for reptiles, really great for plant generation, including trees. Well, we haven't got any wild boar there, but we can disturb the ground. It's a real sort of look at how does a bit of forest really function? What are the bits that are missing, and then seeing if we can accelerate, replicate, or restore them in some way.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. In the Netherlands, I saw the bison living among wild horses in a big landscape, and there was a cycle commuter path with people in mobility vehicles and on bicycles scooting along. And between the cycle path and the bison was a 2-strand electric fencing. You know, one was sort of chest high and the other was sort of waist high, but really nothing. If you go and see the bison at Wild Blean in Kent, with the Kent Wildlife Trust and the Wildwood Trust have put together that amazing project about restoring these natural processes. You know, the bison are like woolly chainsaws, Charlie Burrell of Knepp called them, because they eat the small trees and knock them over, and they're like mini rhinos or elephants or something. You've got a zoo fencing, you've got kind of Fort Knox fencing. What does Forestry England think about that? You know, how can we make it easier to have wild herbivory? You know, bison or aurochs, you know, these kind of animals, or tauros, which are the modern day equivalent of aurochs, or even wild boar. That wild boar, even though they're present in swathes of Western Scotland and they're in your Forest of Dean and in Gloucestershire, they're still classified as dangerous wild animals under the law, and you need a 10-foot razor wire fencing to keep them. How do we square that? How do we get people less afraid of wildlife so that we can start using these natural wild tools at our disposal?
Yeah, no, it's a really hot issue, isn't it? I think so. I mean, similarly, when I was in the Netherlands a few weeks ago, you know, a herd of Taurus cattle, which I've been told were really quite fearsome. Again, cycle path right through a herd, and there were people cycling right past them. And as you say, bison behind just, you know, a couple of strands of electric wire. Bison aware of us, only 50 yards away, but really not bothered, not that interested at all. So it's all about the legislation. And in this country, we've got a body of environmental legislation which was designed for one particular purpose or a range of particular purposes. And now what we're doing is something very different with our landscape. So the two bits of legislation which really cover all this are the Wildlife and Countryside Act and Section 14 of that, which is licenses what animals can and can't be released into the countryside without a licence, and also the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, which itself was designed for, you know, people who want to keep a lion in their back garden. It wasn't really designed for those situations, which we're talking now about, thinking what animals might we need or want to put back in the landscapes for the ecological function they perform. So we're at a time when people are being innovative, and I think if that's one thing I would really flag about what we're doing in forest wilding is innovation. It's looking at how can we push the envelope? How can we push the boundaries? What are the things that really might just make a difference, that take us out of a conventional nature conservation headspace and start to really push the boundaries of what can be done? And of course, one of the huge advantages we have is we've got the land to do it. Now, a lot of people who are keen for these sorts of changes don't have the land to do it. They often don't perhaps have the resources either. Well, we've been given some decent money by DEFRA to explore some of these things. And we're very willing, we're very keen to try these new things, because as an organisation, that's what we do. When we get moving, we can move a lot very quickly. You can see the sort of scale that we're working at with forestry. So we've done some work just starting to look at herbivory of our wild areas and thinking, well, what sort of animals would we have? And it's very similar to the sorts of things which the Burrells have explored at Knepp and we were talking about down at your place a few weeks ago. And so there are obviously the domestic animals like conic horses and other things like exmoors. Obviously looking at domestic cattle and them as surrogates, so things like English longhorns and so on. Up in Wild Ennerdale, we've got Galloways, and the farmer there who's running them, it's absolutely brilliant. It's a profitable upland beef business. So it's replaced the sheep businesses, which were not economically viable. So you've got an example there where actually this guy's making a profit, and he's a strong advocate for how you can have food production alongside this natural process, which is working. Interesting, he was profiled in Farmers Weekly as a really good example, but they failed to mention it as part of a wilding project, funnily enough. So those things, lots of people are trying, and I used to work for Norfolk Wildlife Trust, and I managed a herd of 28 Shetland ponies, which was hilarious and very difficult at different times. But what people are talking about now is actually much more ecological function of animals, rather than just mimicking old farming. It's actually ecological function, and there's some fascinating stuff, isn't there, about the activity of these surrogates. You need the social structures to get the activity. So things like how the males of the Taurus cattle will create these huge bare ground patches, which they don't do if they haven't got any other males to compete with. And of course, bare ground's vital for reptiles, vital for all sorts of plants and invertebrates and so on. So that ecological function is really important, but it's starting to push the boundaries of what that legislation was designed for. So when you start talking about bison, they're captured by these two bits of legislation. And at the moment, people, I think, are just in a bit of a very cautionary, risk-averse space. And we're starting to look at these things. We're starting to look at bison. We, looked at what's going on at Blean. Really, really interesting project, and great to see the third generation of bison being born there as well, which is terrific. Firstly, is it worth the effort? I mean, these things are hard, but then we like a challenge in Forestry England, so it's we're happy to sort of see if that's worth doing, and then see how can we optimise this? How can we make this easier for people? So we are discussing these things with Natural England and with DEFRA, and thinking, okay, this is a really interesting space. There's, the wider public out there are really supportive of these sorts of initiatives. There's lots of landowners who are interested in bison, for example, but have been put off by the legislative landscape. Whereas if, as part of a public body, we can work with our other public bodies to think, how do we find solutions to this stuff? And then that way we help move the whole sector. Now, it might be we come up with the answer, no, this is too hard, but let's not start there. Let's start with the idea that, well, it's interesting, it could make a real difference, let's give it a go.
Yeah, I was so happily surprised when I was in DEFRA to find time and again that Forestry England was really the most ahead of the curve when it comes to these kind of conversations. We wanted cool things to happen and wilding initiatives to be undertaken or approved. We wanted less caution and more experimentation. And always we found that Forestry England were the driving force. Hopefully it'll be on Forestry England land where we ultimately get reintroduction of lynx to England. And I've been supporting the Missing Lynx project. I threw a dinner for them earlier this year and we raised a bunch of money. And I mean, it should be so easy. Lynx are back now because of reintroductions and natural recovery in every single continental European country. It's about the size of a Labrador, not much bigger than a Labrador. They don't tend to take livestock. They're certainly not a threat to people. It's a forest-dwelling, secretive, mid-sized cat. Like, is this going to happen? And how does Forestry England think about it?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, as you say, they're a native animal. Many people will say they ought to be back here. But it's obviously one of those, and this is often the way with species reintroductions, is they can be contentious. And our position is almost an agnostic one. It's recognising their ecological value. So, we have got far too many deer in our forest. They damage regeneration. They damage our ability to grow trees. And of course, one of the things that lynx do is eat roe deer. So, we see that ecological role there, not just as a sort of simple matter of deer control, but as part of an ecological system. We've thought about whether we could accommodate them alongside commercial forestry, and we're pretty confident we can. But ultimately, it's a decision that has to be made by the communities around where these releases happen. So we're part of those communities. Our staff, our foresters, they all live in and around Kielder, so they're part of that community. And this is the key thing. And this is, we talked to the Missing Lynx project. We're not part of the project, but we obviously talked to them. So for us, it's about keeping our ears open, keeping our minds open, and working with that project where it needs to. And ultimately, the decision comes down to the local community and to government. So, and as a public body, if that's what the community and government decide, we will do it. And because we're Forestry England, we'll do it really well as well.
And what about wolves and bears, Bev? We've got to have them back too. You go to the Apennines in Italy, or go to Cantabria in northern Spain, the Pyrenees, or again, much of Europe, you'll find on national forest estates and in national parks, animals which are much harder to live with than the lynx.
I know. Actually, one of my colleagues actually has a side project where she's working in Nepal with farming communities which have to face tigers just in their sort of daily encounters. So some of the stuff we're talking about is not in world terms challenging, but in a UK term, it is very challenging. And we're doing some work at the moment called the Influential Species Review, where we're just looking at, rather than just randomly choose species because we like them, we're thinking which ones are the most effective. And of course, brown bear is coming up as quite an important animal in that, as is wolf. But are they socially feasible? And this is a key part of species reintroductions. Are they ecologically feasible and are they socially feasible? And you have to have those two sitting alongside. Otherwise, by and large, those projects don't succeed. So it's, those two things hand in hand, ecological feasibility and social feasibility. At the moment, for me, I mean, whilst in principle, I'd like to see it, it's certainly not something that Forestry England is looking at. And it would be a matter for government to lead that discussion, I think.
Bev, when you came to see me at Camwood, I learnt so much. We walked around my place, and of course there's an element of woodland there. There's the plantation forestry, Sitka and Douglas, and also a little bit of plantation oak, admittedly old, 180-year-old plantation oak, and then the rest is an emerging mosaic of habitats and wood pasture. And you gave me some lovely advice. We've done lots of it. Since you were there, we've cut out all the conifers. And that was happening anyway under a permit issued by Forestry Commission. And all of those conifers are gone. And we made these wonderful 12, 14-foot high brash piles, which are going to be wonderful denning habitat for wildcats and pine martens and voles and all kinds of species, owls and birds. So we've got these huge piles through the woods where the conifers were. And we were pleasantly surprised to find lots of beanpole tall oaks and birch and willow and poplar and other things growing among the pines. So we've got the beginnings of a wood pasture there. And you used the term which has stayed with me, which is ad hocery. So what I want to ask you, ad hocery, you said, do lots of ad hocery in the woods. And I said, well, what does that mean, Bev? And I guess what I'd love you to describe is, what would you tell someone who says, I've got a bit of recreational woodland, I'm not particularly interested in timber production. There are lots of people out there who've got 5 acres or 20 acres, or they're in charge of it because they work for a council or an NGO or a college or some endowment, and they've got a piece of woodland for whatever reason, and the timber income isn't meaningful, or they don't even have commercial plans for the timber. And it might be conifers, it might be a mix. What's your advice for that person if they just want to apply rewilding principles and they want to maximize nature in the woodland that they own?
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I think one of my responses to your question was stop thinking of it as a woodland. And of course, you've got the advantage there. You've got space outside the woodland, and the woodland is sort of in context, isn't it, with that wider landscape that you're looking after there. But I suppose that sort of idea of stop thinking of it as a woodland is about taking off the habitat goggles. So, I mean, I've been working in nature conservation for best part of 40 years now. And in the early part of my career, all of the emphasis, we always talked about the importance of semi-natural habitats. And that's because that's what we'd inherited. So the way to manage a grassland was as a hay meadow. The way to manage a woodland was as a coppice woodland, and so on. But of course, all that we're doing is mimicking natural processes. So coppicing, and we think of it as the process which gives us, wood products like pea sticks or firewood or whatever it is. All it's doing is mimicking what a bison would do, or an auroch would do, in smashing through woodland and creating open space. And of course, open space in a woodland is one of the most valuable things. Sometimes it's almost like the trees are the least important part of a woodland. Actually, it's that complexity which is really important, and having that mixture of early successional open space, so bare ground where, say, naturally a boar or a bison or an auroch might have scuffed around, and that's created a regeneration niche for a whole load of new plants, and for some trees as well, through to areas of grass and through to scrub, through to low trees, through to big trees, through to old trees, through to dead trees. That's what you're after. So it's all about complexity, and thinking, well, how can you introduce that. And I think you can do it at any scale, can't you? I mean, if you've only got a few acres of woodland, you can do some of that at least, but you can scale it up when it's larger.
Do you remember those Victorian home guides, Mrs. Beeton?
I'm not that old.
I've got one. I've got one somewhere in my kitchen. It's a big leather-bound book, right. Mrs. Beeton's kind of home management. And there's one line in there that I absolutely love, which said, "No matter how small your garden, you must set aside at least 1 acre for rough woodland."
Oh, brilliant. Lucky old Mrs. Beeton.
But you could make magic in an acre or two of woodland.
Yeah, absolutely.
So whatever size it is, what does that really mean? Does that mean going in there with a chainsaw and cutting stuff down? And so what do you do? Where do you start? If you've got this 20-acre woodland, let's say it's dark inside the wood because the canopy is closed, but you have got a mix of species and you want to apply rewilding principles. You want to create the kind of environment you just described, which is a kind of sun-dappled mosaic of different habitats. Stop thinking of it as a woodland. How do you achieve that? It's got to be a chainsaw and perhaps a digger to dig some ponds.
I think those are probably two of the most useful tools you might have. And yeah, so when we talk about replicating a natural process, I mean, you know, the chainsaw is the bison, the rotavator is the wild boar, the digger is the beaver. And two things I'd say would be structure and species. The more of each you've got, the better. So the 20-acre woodland, look at that and say, well, where could I create some open space? And that might be, you know, just clearing out a ride or something like that. In terms of structure, if you've got lots of sort of all evenly spaced trees, which is often the case, isn't it, with those sorts of woodlands, is think, okay, there's some trees here that I could coppice and allow to regenerate. Of course, then you've got to think about, have I got too many deer? In which case you might just need to be the wolf and reduce your deer, and that might be just by putting a fence up. And then you think about all thorny scrub, how important that is for regenerating trees, even in a small wood, is really important. So it's looking at the woodland afresh and saying, how can I make this more complex? And what are the tools I've got that enable you to do that?
And what if I'm a different kind of owner? What if I'm a bigger landowner or even an absentee investor owner of a larger plantation block of forestry? Now, lots of people down here in London, where I'm sitting now, manage pension funds or insurance companies or large family offices. And in the portfolio, they've got some commercial forestry, often managed by an external manager like Gresham House or Foresight or some such. But if it's theirs and they want to do the best by nature, but ultimately it is a timber business, what do you do with that? You've got a 1,000-acre kind of artless block of commercial monoculture, which is due for harvest, say, a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades out. What can you do there without dramatically impacting your investment return?
This is exactly the situation that we're facing. One of the advantages of the public forest estate, the nation's forest, is we can try things which are riskier that your private landowner is less likely to take. But the answer is the same, really, which is if you want that forest to still be there in 100 years, if you want that forest to still be producing timber for you in 100 years, if you want that forest to still be producing an income for you, you've got to make it better for nature. Because if it's not better for nature, it just won't be there. So, you know, our wild areas, they're not areas we're taking out of production. There are some areas there where we are because it's just the right thing to do, you know, where, so down in Purbeck, for instance, the production forecast for some of our areas on the very, very poor soils are so low, doing almost anything other than trying to grow commercial timber is a good idea. So the land tells us what to do in those circumstances, you know. But coming back to this key principle of forest resilience, it's got to be resilient to climate change. So the tree you plant today has got to be the tree that's producing an income in 100 years' time. So you've got to know what that's doing. And we've done a lot of work on that to look at what are the trees we need to shift to, but also being more complex, so that should any pests or diseases come in, you haven't lost everything. So there's a big risk at the moment with the spruce bark beetle, which on the continent is devastating thousands of hectares of spruce woodland. Now, something like that gets into Kielder, for instance, which is, you know, nearly 70,000 hectares, largely, I mean, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's predominantly Sitka. That's all our income gone. So it's exactly the same for a private investor. So by all means, harvest what's harvestable as it comes to maturity, but gradually restructure so that it's more complex and more resilient.
and establish wild corridors and areas that are dedicated for nature, as you said, in those areas that are not particularly productive, which is what they do, for example, in the cattle ranches in Australia. Some of these cattle ranches are 1 million acres. And I had Tim Allard from the Australian Wildlife Conservancy on, and his biggest opportunity is persuading those cattle ranchers to set aside 10, 20, 30% of their land for nature. And it's the rocky bits or the steep bits and that are most suited for that. The beauty of rewilding, of course, is that there is no end game, in a sense. When you plant a woodland, you think, well, I can now harvest that in 30 years or 50 years, or I'm going to have a woodland, when I'm an old man that I can go and sit in. Whereas what I've learned at my place in Canwood is that rewilding is really a process, a journey. It was joyful on the very first day. And after 3 months, I started to see little pockets of kind of scrub popping up that spring through the middle of the fields. And it's really the unfolding of an eternal process that is joyful and not necessarily any kind of destination. The difference with you, of course, is that you're shifting an organization, a mindset, and you're dealing with a massive portfolio. What does the future look like? How would you encapsulate what Forestry England might be in 20 years' time, let's say?
Well, firstly, can I say to have more people who feel what you feel at Canwood in our forests, that sense of wonder from entering a magical place which can really speaks to your soul about something bigger than you. Because often our forests aren't really that. They are sort of, they can be a bit soulless for some people, but they're still brilliant for recreational sorts of things, but they can be better. So yeah, firstly, I want more people to be leaving the forest going, what a sense of wonder that was. What an amazing experience that was. So at the moment, we're part of the Forest Wilding programme is, we've got a lot of species reintroduction work going on, looking at things like beavers and wildcats and pine martens, and as well as white-tailed eagle, which you mentioned. We're just on the threshold of thinking about, we're about to release a feasibility study for the release of golden eagles into this country. So that could be our next step. So we're starting to look at what other species are important. We're looking at not just the big stuff, but little stuff too. So wood ants turns out a really important ecosystem engineer and help control aphid populations in trees. So the future, I think, for us is twofold. One is to expand these areas of wild areas. So we're really driving that change and experimenting with different techniques and just innovating, continuing that process that you've seen at DEFRA, which is great to hear, incidentally, but also looking at more of those species as well as a larger footprint, if you like, of the release of those species. So yeah, we've got 5 beaver projects looking at free-living beavers across the whole of the nation's forests, and we'd look to do more of that. So just more, really, actually. It's probably as simple as that.
Bev, Forest Wilding Programme Manager at Forestry England. Really, it's, I think, the coolest, most important job in England at the moment. What you do is so cool. It's such a joy to hear you talk about all of this. I hope you'll come back to Canwood soon, and thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
That's an absolute pleasure.
I can't help feeling very, very excited about the future of Forestry England. It's just such a big organisation and it's so forward-thinking, so unexpectedly so. I hope you feel the same way. If you enjoyed the conversation, please do give us a like or a share on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. Spread the word. It makes a big difference and I'm truly grateful. Next time, I'm going to be talking to author Dave Mountjoy, whose book Being with Cows is deeply meaningful and very beautiful. Dave lives with his family in the wild foothills of the Pyrenees. And a bit like me, Dave found tremendous solace, meaning, healing, and I guess in time joy in the natural world following a family bereavement. Dave's got a wonderful story to tell and talks about nature so poetically. I hope you'll join us.